reclining at Jesus' bosom against his chest during the Last Supper, as the King James Version describes. But before we get any weird ideas, it's important to understand that people didn't sit at tables back in Jesus' day the same way as we do today. You see, back then, people would recline at the table. They had long benches, and people would lean on their left elbow, laying on their side with their feet out behind them, leaving their right hand free to eat with. And so if John was leaning on Jesus' breast, as the Bible describes, then he must have been reclining on Jesus' right hand. Right here. To be able to lean his head against Jesus' chest. We're not surprised by this, knowing that John was Jesus' closest friend. That makes sense to us. However, many of us would be shocked to learn who was reclining on Jesus' other hand. Now, the Bible doesn't explicitly say this. I want to make that clear. So take what I'm going to say next with a grain of salt. But piecing together the evidence, it seems quite likely that the person reclining on Jesus' left hand was none other than Judas himself. What makes it even more incredulous is that the place reserved for the guest of honor was not on the right hand of the host, which Jesus was that night, but rather on the left hand. In other words, Judas was sitting in the place reserved for the guest of honor. Now, how did he get that spot? We don't know. Knowing his ambition, it could have been anything. But by allowing Judas to sit or to recline in the place of the guest of honor was Jesus' prerogative. He was in charge that night, remember. And so by allowing Judas to occupy that position to his left, he accorded Judas the highest honor among his disciples in that upper room that night. Perhaps one of the strongest pieces of evidence that Judas was reclining next to Jesus comes from Matthew 26, verse 23. I invite you to turn to that text. Matthew 26, verse 23. When asked to identify his betrayer, Jesus responded by saying this: "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me." People who share a bowl are usually situated beside one another. And so it is quite likely that Judas was reclining next to Jesus. This morning, I'd like to focus your attention on John's account of the Last Supper by inviting you to turn back in your Bibles to John chapter 13, beginning with verse 21. John chapter 13, 21. It says here that Jesus, troubled in spirit, says to his disciples, I tell you the truth. One of you will betray me. The disciples look at one another in shock. Wondering who could do such a terrible thing. They've been together now for 3.5 years, sitting, learning at the feet of Jesus, witnessing his miracles, receiving his power to heal the sick, to raise the dead, to cast out demons. They know how much he loves them. They know how straight he has been with them. How could anyone among them even think of doing this terrible thing? Suddenly, the atmosphere in that room turns thick with suspicion. The disciples begin asking, Lord, is it I? Is it I? Is it I? And slowly they begin to realize that they don't know whom they can trust in that room anymore. And open conversation ceases. And an awkward silence fills the room. Finally, Peter motions to John, who's sitting beside Jesus, of course, to ask Jesus who the betrayer is. That's when John leans back against Jesus' breast and whispers in his ear, Lord, who is it? And in verse 26, Jesus whispers back to John. And he says, it is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. And then taking that piece of bread, Jesus dips it into the bowl beside him and hands it to Judas. We tend to think by this act that Jesus exposed his betrayer this way. But we forget that the other disciples haven't heard what Jesus said to John. if they did, I'm certain that they would have attacked Judas right then and there. These were, after all, rough men. Simon the Zealot, who would stick you in the back with a knife. Peter, who would cut off your ear while trying to do something worse. What do you think they would have done to Judas? But John is the only disciple who knows. And apparently he's in shock at what he has just witnessed. And so before John can recover and say anything to warn the other